All right. Well, we are going to get started tonight. In the time that we have left, want to try to get back into our series here. Last week we started talking about this category of passages and references that Donald Morgan calls Bible absurdities. And we covered 5 of them last week, and we didn't get to the last one. And so I wanted to touch on that one tonight, and then try to get into the atrocities, so-called. But let's see here. Okay. Oops. Let's send this out. Yeah. Atrocities. How do you spell atrocities? My spell suggestion figured it out for me. So once I got started, but yeah, right. So remember, we talked about absurdity, right? The definition of something that is absurd means that it is self-contradictory, right? Something that is inherently contradictory of itself. And so as we examined these so-called absurdities, we found that they're only absurd if you assume that God does not exist, or you assume that the Bible is inaccurate, or you assume a naturalistic worldview where everything that happens in the world has to be explainable by natural phenomena rather than recognizing things like, and the Bible says God is the creator and he spoke the world into existence. Well, if that's the God that we're talking about, then it's awful hard to say it's absurd when he does something that we can't explain, okay? But that's what Morgan tries to do. The last one, though, was from the New Testament. And this one I thought was interesting, John chapter 6. What's that? Most excited for this one? Okay. Well, John 6, 24 through 30. Okay? And if you're familiar with this passage, and Morgan provides some background for us here, but John 6, 24 through 30, what does it say there? I'll read it to you. This is out of the Christian Standard Bible. It reads this: When the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum looking for Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you get here? Jesus answered, Truly I tell you, you are looking for me, not because you saw the signs, but because you ate the loaves and were filled. Don't work for the food that perishes, but for the food that lasts for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal of approval on him. And the people asked, What can we do to perform the works of God? They asked. Jesus replied, This is the work of God, that you believe in the one he has sent. Verse 30, What sign then are you going to do so that we may see and believe you? They asked. What are you going to perform? Now, here's what Morgan says. So I'm not making up this stuff. I copied and pasted this directly from his document. Here's what he says and how he describes this. A large crowd of persons, probably several thousand, asks Jesus for a sign so they might see and believe. This occurs immediately following the feeding of the multitude, which should have been one of the greatest miracles and most convincing signs of all time. All right, so what are we supposed to make of this? Morgan says this is absurd, that these people would ask for a sign immediately following the feeding of the multitudes in which they saw Jesus take a small amount of food and multiply it to feed this vast group of people who were starving. What are we supposed to make of that? Any thoughts on that? Well, it's all unbelief. There's no doubt about that. Okay?
I mean, if I mean, if anything, this is demonstrating exactly what Christians are continually saying, of you will not believe unless God works in your heart, no matter what kind of sign you saw.
Sure. I mean,
There's so many people that we're asking baskets from, how would they know? I mean, we know the disciples knew when we started with,
sure.
but I'm not sure that
Yeah.
5,000.
Did the people all realize? That's a good question.
At that time.
I've never actually considered that before. Did the people all know?
5,000 people sitting on the hillside.
It's not like it was
They're
live
passing
stream.
baskets.
I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
That's like the story of Jesus' life or ministry during that time, that, doing miracles and people still didn't believe in.
Well, this is what gets me about this, right? So let's put this in a little bit of different terminology. You have a crowd of people who've just seen Jesus do something amazing. Feed a multitude of people with just a small little bit of food. Something absolutely astounding. And Morgan is right when he suggests that this should have been one of the most convincing signs of all time. Okay, fair enough. And yet, these people continue to be skeptical. Just like he is. So if it's absurd for these people to be skeptical, guess who it's also absurd for? Yeah, Donald Morgan. See, he has fallen into this trap. He set himself up for this. His claim of absurdity is absurd. Because, and he, by the way, notice what he's doing here. He is treating this account as if this actually happened, which, based on what we've read of what he's written so far, I think he doesn't believe that this actually happened. But he's treating it as if it did actually happen, and therefore it's absurd. Well, again, which is it, Mr. Morgan? Did this really happen? And therefore, you're right. It's absurd to disbelieve after Jesus does this amazing miracle that proves that he's God. I mean, I agree with you on that score. But if you're actually happened because the Gospels are fictitious, because the miracles aren't real, because because they deny science or whatever, blah blah blah, whatever you're going to say. If that's the way you're going to go, then guess what? You can't use this to claim absurdity because you don't think this happened anyways. So people's lack of belief would make perfect sense to you. He just illustrates his own kind of the circularity here of his own reasoning here. Yeah.
Actually, he has some faith here because he sees that, this is actually one of the greatest miracles and the most convincing signs. So they recognize it. But
yeah.
the people here, I believe the answer is, you can find the answer is in 7 verse 6. The truth is, you want to be with me because I fed you, not because you saw the miracle signs. And then he goes on to say, verse 27, but you shouldn't be so concerned about perishable things but they were just concerned about that physical. The blessing instead of fellowshipping with Jesus, because when you come to verse 66, they actually only departed. He left. They didn't understand. They don't understand what they should eat. Unless with my body.
I think they understood it perfectly. I actually think in this chapter, I think that by the end of the chapter, now, at this point, they don't understand. By the end of the chapter, I think Jesus has made it very clear to them exactly what it means. And they are unwilling to follow him there.
Yeah, they departed.
Yeah.
Except the apostles and the
right, the ones who actually believe. Right,
yeah.
Right. And of course, they recognize that no, they're not going to leave because this is the only place they can go to get the truth, right? But again, I think this betrays the fact that, and Arya mentioned this, we would quote Romans 1, right? That men see the invisible attributes of God and yet refuse to glorify him and honor him as God. So again, this is a great example, and Donald Morgan kind of gives us a prime example of what this looks like when a skeptic looks at the evidence and says, yeah, but I don't believe it anyways, and it's ridiculous. Well, you're just proving the point, again, by your own example here. Yeah.
I think in Donald Morgan's worldview is that if there was empirical evidence for God that people would believe in,
Right.
He doesn't understand the idea of the rebellion of God. And so for him, well, I saw there was evidence in this chapter, so very solid evidence, and so for him, well, if this were true, obviously people would believe, and unfortunately, that's not how people work.
Right. It shows a great deal of naivety when it comes to understanding human nature.
I mean, I wish
Yeah.
we worked that way. I honestly wish we were.
Well, right. If it was just that simple, then again, Romans 1 would read very differently. Romans 1 would say everyone sees the invisible attributes of God and everyone falls down and worships him because it's obvious that he's God. Because that's what Romans 1 says, that everyone knows that he's God. But instead of worshiping him, we become vain in our minds. Our thinking is darkened out. Yes.
Instead of that creation.
Yeah, I had a conversation with my brother about this today because I was listening to an audiobook by Stephen Hawking, who just passed away about a year or two ago. But brilliant man as far as the intellectual understanding of theoretical physics. And physics is one of those areas that I've always enjoyed. So I read his stuff and I enjoy it. And he was talking about the question. Hawking was talking about the question of, is there a God, and trying to answer that question. And I messaged my brother and I said, man, it shouldn't surprise me, but it astounds me every time I hear someone who is so intelligent and yet they sound so foolish because they don't even realize how the massive gaps in their thinking and their worldview, because they deny the very foundation that they're trying to stand on to build their case. But it's exactly what the Bible says, right? This is what we do. We see the truth about God, we raise our fist in the air and we say, not today. And that's really the human response to these things. And again, we see it exactly here in John 6. It's exactly what the crowd does. Morgan's right. The evidence is there in front of them. They refuse to see it. But he misses the fact that he's doing the same thing. And the fact that he's removed 2,000 years from this event doesn't change it. That he's doing the same thing. And again, if you want proof of what I'm saying, absolute proof of what I'm saying, Luke chapter 16 gives you the absolute proof of what I'm saying. The story of the rich man and Lazarus. Rich man's in hell, and he's speaking with Abraham, and he says to Abraham, send someone to go tell my brothers so they don't come to this place. And Abraham says to him, they have Moses and the prophets. In other words, they have the scriptures, they have the Bible, the Word of God. And the man says, no. If you send them someone from the dead, they will listen. And Abraham says, if they don't hear Moses and the prophets, they will not hear even though one would rise from the dead. And the ironic thing, of course, Jesus telling this parable, Jesus is going to rise from the dead. And men are still going to, as Morgan is proving, men are still going to reject him, right? So the scripture is enough. You didn't have to be there to see it. It's written in scripture. That's enough. And yet, what do men do? We reject it. So I thought this was an interesting point because this one, he kind of illustrates the very same unbelief and the hard-heartedness that we see in the chapter. We see it in Morgan. The very fact that he brings this one up kind of exposes that. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Again, more reason to pray for this man and others like him because we realize that it's not for lack of truth. It's not for lack of knowledge of the truth because they clearly know the truth. It's that stubborn, hard-hearted rebellion that turns away from the truth. That you and I know, if it weren't for the grace of God, we would be doing the same thing. Because that's our tendency, that's our natural tendency is to say, no thanks, I don't want to believe this stuff. I want to be, I want to go my own way, and yet it's only the grace of God that has opened our eyes to this and compelled us in a way to believe, because we otherwise wouldn't have. I think that's important for us to remember that. Yeah.
I can't help but think of, if I'm sure those of you who were saved later on in life, you can relate, going back through life and how many times was the truth told to me and I ignored it or it just flew over and I didn't want to hear it it was told to me many times before I ever became saved.
Yeah. So I think it's good for us to remember that, and this is a reminder of that. It's not for lack of the knowledge of the truth. The issue is the will of man that is hardened against God. That's the issue. Okay? And of course, that's the thing the Spirit of God has to overcome, because that's why we can't just go and and grab someone on the street, get in their face, tell them the gospel, and then they must get saved. Well, that's the one thing I can't do is I can't change their heart. I can't give them the will to believe, right? I can tell them the truth. We should, but I can't cause them to believe. That's something that's outside of my control. The Spirit of God has to draw them, has to convince them and change their heart, and all those things that the Bible speaks about. Let's move on. So that was absurdities. I want to get to atrocities. There's more. He lists more atrocities than he did absurdities. There were 100 and I counted 106 or 103. I forget 103. I think of what he called absurdities. When it comes to atrocities, he lists 145 of them by my count. And I think it's worth noting the definition of an atrocity. What is an atrocity and what is not? And I think we have to be careful here to understand something. So the dictionary, Merriam-Webster.com, says that an atrocity is a shockingly bad or cruel act. Now, it's an interesting word to use in this context, because if we're going to call something shockingly bad or cruel, we have to have some sort of standard, right? Some sort of measurement to say this is bad, really bad, shockingly bad. If we don't have an objective standard, right, something that is timeless, something that doesn't change, then it really quickly kind of becomes an atrocity, because I'm the one that defines atrocity in this case, and you might define it differently in your case. See, if there's not some sort of objective standard that we can all point to and say, here's the right, here's the wrong, here's the loving, here's the cruel. So it's interesting because, again, the whole objection is something as an atrocity really assumes the presence of an absolute standard. And again, I can't say for sure, but I suspect that Donald Morgan would reject the idea of an absolute and objective standard of right and wrong. I just based on the things that we've read of him. Now, the other thing is interesting too. How many are familiar with the idea of a war crime? Did you know that the idea of war crimes is a modern invention? In fact, really, the whole concept of war crimes really only began to be developed in the end of the 19th century. So we're still really less than 200 years removed from the beginning of the development of the whole concept of war crimes. Now, war crimes, as we think of them, existed. Certainly people committed heinous acts during war, but they weren't the whole concept of what we, and I didn't make that up, by the way. You can go to the United Nations website, the office of, they say there that the modern idea of war, the idea of war crimes is a modern invention within the last 150 years. And what that means, though, and the reason I bring that up, is that we have to be careful that we don't read modern definitions back into things that are historical. So when we talk about atrocities here, we have to do our homework. We can't read something in terms of modern agreements, modern warfare, and read that back into, and then say, well, there's an atrocity committed. Well, that may be so if you're using a 21st century definition, Geneva Conventions and all that stuff. But that didn't exist until not that long ago, really. Vast majority of human history, no such conventions existed. So we have to take that into consideration. Now, all that said, I used a random number generator to select 6 of these for us to examine again, so try to be fair here. So let's look at them in turn. Numbers 25, verse 4. And notice right off the bat, Numbers 25:4, that Donald Morgan specifies that we should read this in the King James Version. And here's what the King James Version says. He doesn't even make comment about this. He just quotes. And the Lord said unto Moses, take all the heads of the people and hang them up before the Lord against the sun. So Morgan says, there you go, an atrocity. Take the heads of the people, of all the people. No, take all the heads of the people and hang them up before the Lord. Now,
the end of that verse says that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel.
Okay, well, we'll get to the why here in a minute, right? Why? But we should at least ask a what question here. What is going on here? I think it's interesting, again, that he specifies the King James Version here. I wonder why he does that. If you look at this, again, this is the Christian Standard Bible translation, Numbers 25, verse 4. The Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that his burning anger may turn away from Israel. If you read the King James Version, at least this is how I take it when I read it, it sounds like he's lopping people's heads off and hanging their heads up, like some sort of display, a gruesome display. Except that's not at all what that's saying. And every modern translation, because I check a lot of them, or at least all the main ones, recognizes these are the heads of the people. These are the leaders. And they are to be hanged, yes. Which again is interesting. How long ago was it in the United States that hanging was considered to be an appropriate method of execution for capital criminals? Not that long ago, really. Decades, I don't even think 100 years. Probably less than 100 years ago, you could find examples of hanging used in the United States. Okay? So again, by 21st century, by 2020 sensitivities, that may be considered to be a cruel act. But we can't read that back into this. Because today we use lethal injection, which frankly is, don't get me started, okay? But we use lethal injection as opposed to other methods of capital punishment, whenever it gets used, which is pretty rare most of the time. Again, this is, to call this an atrocity, again, would demand that this is exceptionally cruel. This is something outside the bounds. But again, I think that the reason he uses King James here is the King James sounds worse, because if you don't read it carefully, it sounds like you're taking the heads off or hanging the heads up. Well, that's gruesome. I mean, honestly, I don't know. I mean, well, we don't do that. But yeah, I just think this is interesting. I think he's trying to play on the King James here, because he only does this, as far as I can tell, 2 of the 145 he specifies King James Version. The rest of them he doesn't specify. So I just kind of wonder, is that why? Because when you read another translation, it's just, okay, he took the leaders of the people and he executed them, and it doesn't seem like an atrocity at all. It doesn't seem like it would fit at all. We pay capital punishment. But why is it considered an atrocity? I'm not exactly sure. Even you have a question or a thought here.
Speaking with King James Version also, I heard it a lot on this that some of the wordings there are not to say that they don't have the same translation anymore. It's like they're obsolete. So this could be the reason.
Well,
because
right. When it says the heads of the people, that's an expression that refers to the leaders of the people. It doesn't mean they're physical heads. He's not taking the heads off of the people. But obviously, we use the word both ways, so it's not necessarily even a bad translation. It's just it sounds bad, especially when taken in isolation.
But if you read it with like mine is NLT,
Yeah.
it's just like seize the leaders.
Yeah. Take the leaders and execute them. Right. Put them to death. Yeah. It's not right. So let's understand the context of too. So let's think about this. This is okay. Numbers 25. Israel has been right. They were led out of Egypt by the Lord miraculously. Right. Did great things. So let them out of Egypt. They've wandered in the wilderness for 4 years, and God has sustained them for that whole time. So think of all the things that God has done for them. And here, they're about to enter into the promised land. 40 years gone by. And what happens here is, as they're about to enter the promised land, in Numbers 25, the people turn away from the Lord. They begin to sacrifice to idols. And they engage in immorality with the women of Moab, another nation that God had specifically told them they were not to engage in any sort of intermarriage or anything. And what are they doing? They're doing exactly what God told them not to do. So again, it's not surprising that the Lord would call for the execution of the leaders of Israel who led the people to engage in this behavior. as if they haven't learned their lesson in 40 whole years. And that's, so again, not surprising, and I would argue here clearly not an atrocity. God is essentially executing justice for crimes that have been committed by the leaders of the people. So I think the fact that he cites the King James, this is my, because he doesn't offer any comment, so I'm left to just speculate here, but I think it's his fault. Okay, he could have told us what he meant here, why he did this. I suspect he picks the King James because it sounds like it's talking about lopping their heads off. That's not what it's saying. Simply saying executing the people, the leaders of the people, because they led the people to this immorality and idolatry after, clearly God is angry with them.
What's interesting is they would read that section a few verses earlier of them committing immorality and see another instance of an atrocity. And if they read them together, it'd show that God agrees with you. That is a problem when people do that.
Right.
Crazy.
Yeah. But then, yeah, we gotta single this one out. So,
And of course, he's forgetting that the reason that they're being executed is because they followed Baal, and the followers of Baal were very well known for doing what I think we would all agree would be atrocities of sacrificing children.
sure, the immorality of the idolatry that goes on here, and all of that stuff that's taking place, the reason the penalty is so severe is because the Lord knows where this leads. He's trying, in many ways, and this simplifies the image quite a bit, but in many ways, it's like as a parent, when you know that your child is engaging in something really dangerous, your reaction to that is going to be a little different than when your child is engaging in something that's maybe they're just obeying, but it's not like life-threateningly dangerous. Okay? But if their life is in danger, your reaction is going to be different. And justifiably so. That's the point here. The reaction here from God is so great because what they are toying around with is something that will, and we know it actually because we have the whole history of Israel, it does. It destroys it. In the end, it destroys it. Like the nation is taken captive away from the land precisely because of this thing that doesn't ever go away. This thing that continues to just plague them. And if it's not the God of the Moabites, and it's the God of the Ammonites, or the Canaanites, or whoever, somebody, one after another. But the point is that God is trying to prevent that. That's why this is so harsh, if you will. But to call it an atrocity is just not. Okay, let's keep going. Joshua 1. That's what JS stands for there. Joshua 1. And this is interesting. This actually covers a whole huge section. So I'm dealing with it all in one here. Okay, I was thankful that this one came up on the random number generator because I wanted to talk about this one. But this is also interesting in the way that Morgan, again, totally misses the context. And in missing the context, he misses the point. Okay, Joshua 1, 1 through 9, and then verse 18. After the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now you and all the people prepare to cross over the Jordan to the land I am giving the Israelites. I have given you every place where the sole of your foot treads, just as I promised Moses. Okay, no atrocities here so far that we can find. Your territory will be from the wilderness and Lebanon to the great river, the Euphrates River, all the land of the Hittites, and west to the Mediterranean Sea. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live. I will be with you, just as I was with Moses. I will not leave you or abandon you. Verse 6, be strong and courageous, for you will distribute the land I swore to their fathers to give them as an inheritance. Above all, be strong and very courageous to observe carefully the whole instruction my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or the left, so that you will have success wherever you go. Instruction must not depart from your mouth. You are to meditate on it day and night, so that you may carefully observe everything written in it, for then you will prosper and succeed in whatever you do. Haven't I commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Okay. Now look down at verse 18. Anyone who rebels against your order and does not obey your words in all that you command him will be put to death. Above all, be strong and courageous. Okay. We only have just a couple minutes, so we won't take a lot of time with this. We don't really need to, actually. It's interesting, even though this is a pretty major objection that most people bring up. They love to cite the conquest, right? The Israelite conquest of Canaan, coming in and destroying the nations, driving them out, wiping them out, doing away with entire cities, entire peoples. But this is a really curious example why he would pick this chapter. Joshua 1 through 9, we just read, relates Joshua's commission. Joshua is given his commission to lead the Israelites into Canaan, right? And they're going to receive the promised land. But you notice how it is described here. It is their inheritance, something which God promised their fathers, something God promised their ancestors before that they would have. And all Joshua 1 through 9 is doing is simply, there's no mention here whatsoever about a command. And this is what's interesting, why he picks this passage, because there's no mention in this passage of the command to destroy all the Canaanites who refuse to leave the land. That command is elsewhere. Usually, when people like to point to that and say, well, that's an example of genocide, and so they like to point that out or call that out as genocide. But he doesn't, again, all these verses are, as far as I can tell, is him saying, you're going to be successful, go and take the land, do everything I told you to do. I promised it to you.
Also, if you actually read through the chapter, the first section he cites is God speaking. The last verse he's citing, it's not God speaking, it's the people under Joshua saying, we will obey.
Oh, come on now. Don't be reading the context. That takes away all the fun of it. I was just going to get to that point. Yeah, verse 18. It's interesting. If you read the context as Ari has pointed out here, the first part is God telling Joshua, here's what you're going to do. And then Joshua commands, verse 10 and 11, he tells the people what they're going to do, goes through to prepare to cross the Jordan. Then verse 12 down to verse 15, Joshua explains now you got to remember what happened. Again, context matters. They had already captured some land on the east side of the Jordan River. And remember, the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh said, hey, we like this land over here. Can we keep it? And they said, sure, you can have it. But here's the deal. You can only have it as long as you cross the Jordan with the rest of us and help us take the rest of the land. Because you can't take your inheritance and leave your brothers to have to go fight and die to claim their inheritance without your help. That's not right. So you can have this land, leave your women and your children there, and your fighting men come with us. And we cross the river. Once we defeat these guys, you go back home, everybody's good. And that's basically what Joshua says to them. He says, here's the deal. Remember the deal you made. Remember the agreement you made. And then as already said, verse 16, here we have the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh answering back. This is their response. So look at from verse 16. Everything you've commanded, that's on Joshua. Everything you've commanded us, we will do. And everywhere you send us, we will go. We will obey you, just as we obeyed Moses and everything. By the way, if I were Joshua, I would not be all that encouraged at this point, because their track record of obeying Moses not all that great. But okay, we'll give them a pass here. Okay, so they say as we obeyed Moses and everything. Certainly, they say this. Certainly, the Lord your God will be with you as He was with Moses. Then this is what they say in the last verse. Anyone who rebels against your order, Joshua, and does not obey their words in all that you command him will be put to death. They're talking about themselves, their own people. They're saying if we don't follow through, we will suffer the consequences, and it will be death. So this is not, again, this is a group of people accepting their duty on penalty of death. Again, kind of like soldiers today who suffer serious consequences if they desert, well, at least they used to. It seems like the last couple presidents, deserters don't seem to face consequences. Now what's that? Well, and then they get their, we have a different way of doing it.
They agree together.
Exactly. Right, and if we don't follow through, then here's the consequences, and the consequences are death. So, again, is this an atrocity? No, it's ridiculous. It's missing the context completely. But absolutely. And twisting it as if it were something it's not. Because this is the testimony of a group of people saying to their leader, we're going to follow you, and if we don't follow you, we are submitting to death. we understand the seriousness of what we're doing.
You're responsible for it. You're gonna be.
I mean, it's kind of a little more serious than the children, cross my heart and hope to die. But that's exactly what they're saying here, right? If we don't do this, we're dead, right? We admit. So that whole thing here, Joshua 1 is a terrible example here for him to pick, but it was one that came up randomly. But I will say this, and I want to just touch on this before we're done here today. It's true that the Lord blessed Joshua's leadership in the conquest of Canaan, and that resulted in the destruction of the Canaanite societies. So it still leaves us with the question, what do we do with that? Because this is a favorite objection that skeptics like to bring up to Christianity, is the genocide of the conquest of Canaan. Now they'll use the word genocide. I think they're misusing that word, but that's whatever. But let's think about this for a second. Let's just compare the invasion of Canaan and what Israelites did there with what happened at the flood. You're familiar with the flood, right? How many people died in the flood? Okay, we don't know the number. We just know it was all but 8, right? So however many died here, I think we could argue it was fewer than died in the flood, right? This invasion of Canaan and the destruction of Canaan, it was less of a loss of life, less destruction, if you will, than those who died in the flood of Noah. So question, what makes the destruction of the Canaanites by Joshua and Israel worse than the flood? If we're going to object and say, well, God, this invasion of Canaan and destruction of Canaanites is genocide, or it's somehow an atrocity, okay? Then we can't play around and say it's Israel's atrocity or it's Joshua's atrocity. If we're going to say it's an atrocity, it's God's atrocity. I mean, let's just be honest. Let's be plain here. Because if this happened, the flood happened, that was worse. God is guilty of far more. Please understand, I'm speaking facetiously here, but if we're gonna blame God here and say God has somehow done something wrong here, God has been cruel, God has been bad, then his action in the flood was worse. Let's just be honest about that. But let's note this, and this is important. If you go back to Genesis 15, just jot this down, we don't have time to look at it, but Genesis 15 and verse 16, that's where we find the promise initially made that God is going to give this specific land to Abraham's descendants. But God tells Abraham something in Genesis 15, verse 16. He says, Abraham, I'm going to give this to you and your descendants, but not for 400 more years. And here's what he says, specifically, and I quote. He says, because the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet full. That line is very important. I'm going to read you what Gleason Archer says about this in his Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, because he touches on this, and he says, the implication of this last statement was that when the wickedness of the inhabitants of Canaan had reached a predetermined accumulation of guilt, right? Think about it. When the iniquity of them is full. So there's a number. There's some level. God is waiting for it to get that high. It hasn't got there yet. But Archer says, then God would have them removed from the land of promise intended for Abraham and his seed. So we need to understand the conquest of Canaan was both an act of judgment against the wicked Canaanites and the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. So we understand God was not wiping out a bunch of innocent people who were just misunderstood, who were never given a chance. In fact, he delayed giving the people of Israel the land for 400 years on purpose to allow the Canaanites the full measure of their sin, to allow them to have free reign to go as far as they chose. And then, when it was time to judge them, they judged them. And it's interesting because, of course, we said in the Revelation, remember the saints in heaven who are below the martyrs before the throne, and what are they crying out to the Lord? how long until you avenge us? In other words, it's just a little while longer. So the patience of God is actually what's on display here. And patience doesn't mean it never happens. Patience means God delays on purpose, intentionally. But that's important. Right? We have the delay here, the patience of God displayed in this, not God being capricious or cruel or vindictive. We have God being very patient, waiting until their immorality and their wickedness is full. Did you know?
And cousin who would say those things like that is unjust, that he knows about it. But she's all behind this Black Lives Matter, and whatever has to happen, people.
Whatever it takes,
If,
right.
whatever it takes, because this is an important issue.
Yeah.
And I think, so God's righteousness is not important, and what he has to do, because he knows best.
Yeah.
But this is okay.
Yeah.
You know, you can justify that.
It's funny. One of my professors from Bible College and Seminary, Larry Oates, he was here a couple of years ago when we had the Pastors and Wives retreat here. He was our speaker, and I remember him talking at that retreat. He was talking about Canaan and the Canaanite culture. And he said that a number of years ago, he went to UW-Madison. He was considering getting a PhD at UW-Madison. He went there, and the only kind of area of study that was of interest to him at all that they had for PhD studies was essentially, I forget the title, but it was basically like Canaanite literature. So he went and sat through one class because they went to Hebrew, so the Hebrew got all of it. And so he picked it up pretty quickly, and he said he found out in one class that he took that basically everything that they had written, everything that they had written is just pornographic. And he decided, I don't really want to spend how many hours of my life to get a PhD just reading this stuff. That's all they have. That's their whole culture was that. And he goes, that's what their culture was. So when God said, I'm tired of it, I'm going to get rid of them. Yeah, well, he allowed their culture to become so debased and corrupt that everything they produced was immoral. That wasn't God acting rashly or being cruel. That was God judging utter wickedness. And again, if you could, the record, it's not like we have great records of that historical time period to know, but the atrocities, the things that were committed by the Canaanites, even among themselves, we get a little sampling of them when you read the book of Judges. We see some of the things that happened in Israel. Some of the things that the people in Israel did as a result of the influence of the Canaanites that were still there. And you get a feel for that, and you go, okay, if that was what happened in Israel with that influence, what would it be like if the whole culture was given over to that? And that's the kind of the picture. So again, I think we have to understand, it's easy to just go, what's genocide? Well, let's stop, let's think, let's look at this a little bit, let's see what God is actually doing here. Let's let the Bible speak in its entirety, and I think that accusation really has no merit. Yeah.
Where is Donald Morgan getting his worldview that murder is evil? In the sense of, I think in general, we have been taught so much that murder is evil, and yes, it is evil, but we never question why do you think it's evil, because from a pure human logic, taking out all morality, murder is good for the murderer. And that is why for thousands of years we've been murdering people. And especially in a Western culture, we teach murder is evil because at our base from the beginning of America, with the morality of God, we believe that murder is evil because it takes away the decision of life and death from God. That's why also suicide is evil.
Well, come on now. Survival of the fittest.
Exactly.
Right? If you were more fit, you wouldn't get murdered. I mean, come on.
Yeah, so
you're right.
So he doesn't really have a basis to claim that, the genocide and the murder of these various people is evil without the component of saying God is sovereign.
Right.
And God is the one who decides who lives and who dies, not you.
And if not God, at least, as I already pointed out, at least some form of external standard. Mm-hmm. So if you're not going to say it's God, then you got to come up with somewhere. And yeah, there's not another answer, but I'm just saying, if you object to God, okay, then tell me where that objective morality comes from. Because if not, then it really is just survival of the fittest. And murder is, yeah, like you said, it can be really convenient for the murderer. I mean, it can be. It was for Ahab when he killed Nabal. It gave him a vineyard that he wanted. It worked out really well for him. I mean, humanly speaking. Right? That's the point. And I think that's a good point that you make, that we have no objective standard of morality if we reject God and the Word of God. Once we set those things aside, then it becomes majority rule, what I say goes, total utilitarianism, which is, the most happiness for the most people, but that leaves that there's a very cruel underbelly there with that. Okay.
I mean,
Um,
the humanists try to get around that and be like, we can still have the no murder thing. We can still have morals without God, but they take out the whole key of how it works.
Yeah. Who was it? I forget now. It was in the Truth Project. Some of you guys remember we went through that. And in the Truth Project, one of the philosophers they talked to, he says, yeah, there's no objective morality, or no absolute. Say absolute. I think he says absolute morality without God. But there's, or no, I'm sorry, he's talking about meaning in life. He's saying there's no meaning, no absolute meaning. There's a lot of proximate meaning. And I'm like, well, okay, so it's kind of the same thing. Like, well, there's no absolute right and wrong, but there's a lot of like relative right and wrong. Well, no, there's not. Because again, that means what's right for you is wrong for me if I say so. It's meaningless. And that's really, I think again, another point we see here of inconsistency on the part of a skeptic who wants to be skeptical of everything except for his own cherished beliefs that he wants to hold without skepticism. And so we'll try to finish the atrocities next week. And the next one is Jael and Sisera and the tent peg. So that's a kind of an interesting story. And see what you can do with that one. And we'll look at some of these. So, but let's close with prayer. We'll be done. So, Father, again, thank you for this time that we get to spend together and looking at your word. Teach us, instruct us from the truth. I pray that your Spirit would guide us and would help us. Sometimes these things are hard for us to understand, hard for us to accept. We are still sinners after all. We do have a sin nature, and we do still have a defiant heart and mind at times. We want to go our own way, and so I pray that you would help us to submit to the truth even when it is difficult, and Lord, help us to trust you for these things. And we just thank you for that. Encourage us now as we go tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.